Torres. This is Nightwaves on BBC Radio 3 with me, Philip Dodd. And you can listen again to this or many other programmes in the archive on our website, as well as the Arts and Ideas podcast. Lenin thought that communism could engineer souls. Well, British politicians have much less lofty ambitions. They want more engineers in the automotive industry, in the building industry, aeronautical engineers, engineers of any and all kinds. But it's a specific image of an engineer, Brunel and Stevenson, builder of bridges and steam engines respectively, that's often conjured up when the government says we need more engineers. It can seem as if we want a rerun of the Industrial Revolution, an updated version of Victorian Britain. But at the same time, and even today during the budget speech, the Chancellor has said we need to make more digital content, as if the future means reinventing what we mean by engineer. Maybe coders, programmers, systems architects are the new Brunels in the making. After all, about 9% of the UK economy is now down to the digital world. So what do we mean by engineer, and why does Britain find it so difficult to inspire them? To talk this through, I'm joined by Ian Livingston, chairman of IDOS, which designed the game Lara Croft, and he's also chairman of the Next Generation Skills campaign. Down the line from Aberdeen by Ben Marsden, a historian of engineering, and by Peter Head in the studio, formerly of Arup, one of the great engineering companies working with most of the major architects in the world. Ian, do you think this fetishisation, if I might put it this way, of Brunel and Stevenson is a kind of nostalgia that stops us seeing what engineers will look like in the 21st century?
Well, of course, we should celebrate their contributions, their achievements. You can never take that away from them. But we have to look to the future, of course, and we're living in a digital age. Computers touch everything in our lives, and we have to make sure, if we want to drive a digital economy, that we have people with the skills to create the digital content that's served around the world through high-speed broadband. And
do you think there is the capacity to imagine a digital engineer, let's put it this way, it's an odd kind of phrase, but who's as important as Brunel and Stevenson were?
We already have those players. You think of the fact that Alan Turing invented the first programmable computer, Tommy Flowers invented the Colossus, the first computer in fact, and Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. So we were already steeped in computing heritage, yet we tend to ignore that as a society, and I think that's ridiculous. OK,
well, let's come back to why we do that. Peter, you belong to a world that still builds buildings. What do you think engineers have to be in the 21st century in the kind of arena you've worked in?
Well, I think the respect and admiration that engineers have got in the past and could have now, I believe is more related to the value we create to people in their daily lives. And when, of course, Brunel and Stevenson built the railways, you could suddenly, instead of taking a day and a half to get to Bristol, you could get there in 2 hours. And so the revering of engineers was related to that extraordinary transformation they made. And it's much harder in current society to create that same transformation. So I think we have a bit of a problem because a lot of buildings and bridges and things we build now actually need a lot of maintenance. They don't often work as well as they should. And actually it might look great, but actually in the way they perform, they're not that great. So I think the role of engineers now is to do with creating systems and ways of living in cities and in agriculture, which actually transforms people's lives. And I think that's possible.
OK. Ben, down the line from Aberdeen, can you just let a whiff of history into this? I mean, what was the Victorian heyday? Why were engineers so valued? Is it something to do with what Peter said? They were actually transforming the kind of social and leisure life and work life of people.
I think it's very easy to say that they were transforming people's lives in that way, but I think it's also important to recognise that the engineers and their various friends had to work very hard to create those images of engineers as iconic figures. So you've mentioned Brunel several times already, and in fact Isambard Kingdom Brunel during his lifetime was much less iconic, as it were, than his father, Mark Isambard Brunel, who most people these days wouldn't actually remember. Something's happening in the 19th century. There are such enormous transformations in communications technology, both in terms of information and in terms of goods. that's impossible to ignore. But the engineers still have to work very hard to get themselves accepted as cultural figures who are changing things for the good rather than just changing things, potentially for the bad for your average working person.
Okay, Ian, I mean, that idea of the engineers as cultural figures, do you think British culture, I mean, there was an argument back in the 80s that it was the Oxbridge model that meant that people who did things, were rather vulgar, trade people. What is it about British culture, you think, that's made engineers who've been central from Brunel to Tim Berners-Lee, why are they not valued here, do you think?
I think it kind of lacks sex in a way, that we celebrate celebrity quite easily, and those who had real value, like engineers, and in today's digital engineers, they're not celebrated enough in media, by government, and that's a crying shame. And talking about transformational, the World Wide Web was certainly transformational. That was Tim Berners-Lee, and inventing the first programmable computer was certainly transformational. And we have a nation of people who are, we're perhaps the most creative nation in the world. Look at our film, our fashion, our music, our architecture, our design, our games, and we're very good at high technology. And yet the creative industries have always seen as being a sort of a fluffy industry run by lovies. There's never acceptance of the contribution that those industries are making. And I'm pleased to say that today's budget, in fact, recognises the industry as being credible. And, the transformation from the word nerd to someone who's making real great contribution stuff is finally being recognised. I mean, Facebook, Twitter, Google, these were invented by nerds, if you like, and they are being celebrated, and everybody wants to be the next Mark Zuckerberg.
Nobody ever thought of as an engineer, Peter, as a lovey. You've got a different problem, haven't you, which is it's the architects who get all the credit for building the buildings. Why do you think in British culture, as it were, engineers have had an insecure status?
Well, I think it does come down to value. I think it actually fundamentally, people can't relate to the value the engineer creates in their lives.
But I don't understand why not. I know that if I go in a building and it falls down, it's your fault, not the architect's fault.
But they don't fall down. That's the point. They don't see it. And yet what they do see is things that don't work. So actually there's always a connotation about that. So actually engineering now is more about retrofitting things to be better than it is about new stuff, particularly in the UK.
So in that sense, you're kind of remedial people.
Yes. Yeah, well, there is a tendency, but of course we've got to remember that with 9 billion people on the planet in 2050, I believe engineers should be really leading the transformational economic and practical ways of actually providing energy, water and food security for the world. And that's really what I see the role is. And I think the digital part of this is very important to help us deliver that.
Ben, with your historian's hat on, can you imagine 2050 engineers leading the world?
I'm not sure if that would necessarily be the best thing. Perhaps in collaboration with other cultural figures. Thinking of some of the other things that have been said, I think one of the issues about engineers is that as long as I've studied them, which is through from the early to mid 18th century up really to the late 19th century, they're often insecure of their status. Government is often concerned about how best to train them, how best to treat them in different ways. And I think part of that is to do with the fact that the engineers see themselves as a relatively late profession in comparison with the older professions, for example, medicine, the law and the church. So although often promoting their own professional status, they've been sort of insecure about how best to do that, whether to do it through education, whether to do it through an association with science, whether to kind of talk immediately about the practical values which they can bring to people's lives. There's been a kind of uncertainty about how best to be a professional engineer. And although engineers aren't lovies, as you put it, I think they want to be cultural figures, but they don't always know quite the best way of doing that.
Well, look, as we're moving, I'm afraid, towards the end of the conversation, I want to put a bigger question to all of you. One of the reasons Brunel and Stevenson were there, it was actually because Britain was the centre of the world. It's demonstrably not the centre of the world anymore. There is a way in which the great markets are in China and India. And in those circumstances, Ian, do you think it is possible to imagine the great